I never imagined an old house could scare me more than the cemeteries I entered as a child, or more than the nights I spent alone in furnished apartments while working outside Egypt. As a person grows older, they start believing that true fear is behind them and that the stories that used to terrify them as a child are just old memories that time has mocked. But what happened after my grandfather passed away taught me that many things don't scare you because they are terrifying, but they scare you because they make you doubt yourself, your mind, and even the memories you thought were the most certain things in your life. My grandfather died at the end of winter after a long life. No one in the family was surprised by the news, because this man was approaching 90 and had been ill for a while, but what now unexpected was that his death would bring the whole family together in the old house for the first time in many years. Each one of us had ended up somewhere else. In Cairo, some were traveling in the Gulf, some got married and moved to another governorate, and some even had children who didn't know what the house their father was born in looked like. Almost 2 days after the burial, the first decision made at the large dining table was that this house must be sold because no one was able to live in it anymore or even afford its expenses. The house itself was of a type that doesn't exist much anymore. An old family home built over 100 years ago. A massive wooden gate, a large reception hall, and rooms connected to each other in a way that made you feel the house grew with every generation that moved in. The truth is, as a child, I was convinced that the house was much larger than its natural size, because every time I wandered through it, I felt there was a new part I had never seen before. But I would always go back and tell myself that it was just a young child's feeling, nothing more. The first night after the funeral, we all sat in a large reception hall to talk about the sale, the inheritance, and the division of the land, and the usual things that happen after any death. The conversation was going very normally, until Uncle Fatih said suddenly that before this house is sold, they must take out all the things in the attic room, so that no one leaves anything behind. That was when the first strange incident in the whole story happened, because everyone sitting there looked at him in genuine confusion. Not confusion at the suggestion itself, but confusion at the words attic room. Uncle Hassan was the first to reply, saying that there was no attic room at all, and that the house roof never had anything on it except a small room for the old bathroom, which was torn down about 20 years ago. But Uncle Fatih laughed and said that was impossible, because he personally used to sleep there during his high school years, and he would hide in it from the noise of the house. Then he began to recount very precise details about this room: the pale green color of the door, the small window that overlooks the canal, and even the old cupboard where my grandfather's old books were stored. The problem was that all these details were so coherent that it made you believe him. But the bigger problem is that my Uncle Hassan swore to God he's been going up to the roof since he was a child until today. And there is no room with those specifications, and it never existed. At first, we thought it was a joke or mixed up memories. But my Aunt Nadia suddenly jumped into the conversation, saying Uncle Fatih must be confused, because the important room wasn't actually on the roof. It was under the main staircase. And that's when the whole mood shifted, because there is no room under the stairs at all. There never was a room. The space there is very narrow, to the point that a small child could barely get in. My aunt then started talking with strange confidence about a small room hidden under the stairs, and that my grandmother used to keep old travel bags and a large copper chest in it. She kept sharing more and more details until we ourselves, Wulu, started imagining the room exactly in front of us, even though it doesn't exist. A few minutes later, something happened that made me feel this wasn't just mixed up childhood memories. My cousin Sharif said calmly that he didn't remember the roof room or the room under the stairs, but he remembers a very long corridor behind the mandara, and that he used to run through that corridor when he was young. And the corridor ended at a door that was always locked. The problem is that the place he is pointing to behind the mandara is just a wall, a concrete wall that we've all known our entire lives. At the very hour I began to feel the atmosphere change. The discussion was no longer just family stories. Every member of the family became completely convinced that their memories were the correct ones. They actually started arguing, swearing, and recounting many situations that happened in completely different places inside this house. The strange thing is that all the stories were logical, and all were full of real details. But it is impossible for them all to be true at the same time. That night I went up to sleep in my grandfather's old room, but sleep was very far away, because their words kept spinning in my head. And every time I remember the confidence of each one while telling the story, I feel something is wrong. Something much bigger than just memory. A person might forget and get confused, but it's very hard to invent dozens of details and situations with the same degree of certainty. Okay. In the name of God and with His blessing, let us begin the episode. In the name of God. This episode is a new story and a new experience from our series of listener experiences and tales. Your very own tales. Let's start today's episode and say, in the name of God. It was nearly 2 a.m. after midnight. I decided to walk around the house a bit to calm down. I went down to walk in the long hallway between the rooms. Everything was completely quiet, until I reached the end of the hallway by an old wooden wardrobe. A wardrobe as old as the house itself. And there, by chance, I noticed something I had never noticed before. The wardrobe was pushed toward the wall in a strange way, as if it had moved from its original place. When I got closer and reached my hand into the narrow gap between it and the wall, I touched something cold and metallic. I pulled it out. It turned out to be an old key, a large copper key covered in dust. But what was truly terrifying wasn't the key. The terrifying part was a small paper tied to it with an old string. On that paper was written in very faded handwriting, the attic room. At that moment, for the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt that something was truly wrong with the house. After I found the old brass key and the small paper tied to it with attic room written in faded ink, it felt as if it came from another time. I stood in the dark hallway for long minutes, feeling like every crack in the house was watching me. Maybe anyone hearing this sentence would think it's just a literary exaggeration, but anyone who has lived in an old family home knows that large houses have a different soul. Not in the sense of the ghosts people talk about in horror stories and such, but in the sense that every wall, every door, and every stair step carries the traces of so many people who lived and left, leaving behind stories and things, much more than just furniture and photos. That's why, while holding the key, I felt I hadn't just found an old piece of metal. I felt I had caught the end of a thread that had been hidden for so many years, waiting for someone to pull it. I went back to my room, kept telling myself maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe this key was made for a room that was removed 50 years ago, or for a storage room no one remembers. But the problem was that I knew deep down that this explanation wasn't convincing. Because the key's presence on the same night we heard the first argument about the attic room was more than just a coincidence. And because the paper itself was written in very old handwriting, resembling the script I used to see in my grandfather's old journals, this was the first time since I returned home that I felt the matter wasn't just about family memories, but directly related to my grandfather himself. In the morning, I went down for breakfast with the key hidden in my pocket, and kept observing people instead of talking. I discovered that observation sometimes says much more than words, and I noticed that each family member was acting differently after the discussion that happened the night before. Uncle Fatty, for example, was strangely determined to go up to the attic and search for the room he claimed existed. And my Aunt Nadia kept telling my mother about a large brass chest she used to see under the stairs when she was young, as if it were a real thing, to the point that she remembered the engravings drawn on it. As for Sharif, he was distracted the whole time, as if he were thinking more about the corridor behind the reception hall than about selling the house itself. In the late afternoon, I decided to go up to the attic alone before anyone noticed. I was expecting to find an ordinary attic just like any other old attic. But the strange thing was that as soon as I reached the top, I felt a very peculiar sensation. A feeling that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. There was something wrong with the place, though I couldn't pinpoint it. Every time I looked around, I felt there was a missing detail. It was as if I were entering a place I had visited 1,000 times, yet at the same time, I had never stepped foot in it before. I kept scanning the corners with my eyes, until I suddenly stopped at the western wall of the attic. The wall itself was very ordinary, but the brickwork traces were not. Part of it differed in shape and color from the rest of the construction. It was a large opening that had been closed off at some point and sealed very carefully, to the extent that any ordinary person might not even notice it. But once you notice it, it's impossible to ever see the wall the same way again. I stood in front of this place for a long time. Every time I look at it, I feel like I remember it. Not just remembering the wall, but remembering what was behind it. And this is the strangest feeling I have ever experienced in my life. A person might remember a picture, a person, or an event. But how can one remember a place they are convinced they have never seen? When I went back downstairs, I was still trying to understand what happened. But the biggest surprise was waiting for me in the sitting room. Sharif was holding an old photo album we found by chance among my grandfather's things. He was flipping through it, visibly very nervous. And as soon as he saw me, he called me over quickly and opened to a specific picture. When I looked at it, I felt my stomach tighten all at once. The photo was very old, perhaps from 50 years ago. It showed my grandfather standing with a group of family members. The problem wasn't in the picture. The problem was in the background, because behind them appeared a door, an old wooden door. A door that shouldn't exist, because where it was now stood a wall. A solid concrete wall. Sharif and I just kept staring at the photo for a very long time without a word. After that, we started looking for other photos. Every time we turned a page, we found a surprise stranger than the one before it. Once, a photo taken in front of a long corridor that no one in the house remembers but Sharif. Another time, a photo showing part of a small staircase that supposedly doesn't exist at all. And another with a very strange circular window that we have never seen in the current house. In that moment, real fear began to enter the story for the first time. Photos don't lie easily. And because having a photo of something that disappeared is different from a memory in a human mind that might have forgotten or imagined things. And because we were now facing physical evidence saying the house was truly different at some point, but the greater terror was what came at night. We decided to spread all the photos out on the large dining table and compare them. And every person in the family began to remember more details as they looked at a picture. The problem was that these new memories weren't bringing us closer to the truth. They were taking us further away from it. Every person began telling a story about a different version of the house. It was as if each one had lived their childhood in a place different from where the others had. In the middle of all this discussion, my grandmother was silent, suspiciously silent, neither disagreeing, nor agreeing, nor even showing surprise. As if she were the only one who knew the real reason for everything happening. Suddenly, in the middle of the talk, my Aunt Nadia asked her a very simple question. "Mom, how many rooms did the house have back then?" The strange thing was that this question made my grandmother's expression change for the first time. She slowly raised her eyes and looked at each one of us. Then she said a very short sentence. But that sentence turned everything upside down. "Depends on who is asking." And she fell silent. At that, we sat looking at each other in total silence. For the first time, someone in the house confirmed the problem wasn't our memory. The problem was the house itself. After my grandmother said that strange sentence and fell silent, the whole gathering remained frozen. It was as if someone had suddenly entered and turned off the lights and sucked the air out of the entire place. The problem was that the way she said it was completely devoid of any joking or exaggeration, or even an attempt to downplay it. On the contrary, she was speaking as if stating a very simple truth, one she had lived with for so many years, that it had become something normal for her. While for us this sent to overturn everything we thought we knew about the house, our childhood, and ourselves. Throughout the night, no one could continue the conversation normally. Everyone returned to their rooms carrying so many questions. As for me, I stayed in the guest room, barely able to sleep. The big house around me was drowned in total silence. The kind of silence that lets you hear the wood expanding from the cold and the sound of wind passing through distant window gaps. And every time I looked at the old photos spread on the dining table, I felt the photos themselves were stranger than any horror story I'd ever heard. One photo would prove the existence of a door, and the next photo would prove the existence of a hallway, and a third photo would prove the existence of a window. But when you put them all together, you realize these places couldn't possibly exist in the same house at the same time. Shortly before dawn, while I was collecting the photos to put them back in the box, something very small caught my attention. I hadn't noticed it before. Most of the photos featured my grandfather in one way or another. Once standing among people, once sitting on a chair or sitting by the wall. But strangely, my grandfather was almost always standing in the same spot, regardless of the photo. And when I started lining up the photos, I discovered something that made my heart beat faster than ever before. Because my grandfather was standing in front of the same door in more than one photo. The problem was that the door itself changed every time. Once behind the attic room, that Uncle Fatih remembered. Once behind the hallway, Sharif remembered. And once behind the room under the stairs that Aunt Nadia swears existed back then. But I felt the whole matter revolved around my grandfather. Bah, not the house, the rooms, or the memories, but my grandfather himself. For the first time, I remember something I had forgotten for many long years. Something so small that I never paid attention to it. Back when I was a child, my grandfather used to take me alone at times, and sit with me in different parts of the house away from the other kids. I used to think it was normal because my grandfather loved me more than the others as I was the eldest grandson. But while sitting in the parlor tonight, I started remembering something stranger. I remembered a specific place he used to take me to constantly. A very quiet place with a long window and sunlight streaming in at an angle during the late afternoon. The problem is that when I tried to locate this place inside the house, I couldn't. I spent the whole night trying to remember, trying to picture it in my mind, trying to connect it to any existing room. But every time I reached the same conclusion. This place doesn't exist. At least it doesn't exist in the current house. In the morning, I went down early before people woke up. I searched almost the entire house, from top to bottom. I was looking for any place that resembled the image that had started coming back to my memory. But nothing matched it. And when I reached my grandfather's old room, I noticed that the large wooden desk inside was slightly moved from its original place. And because I was looking for any strange detail, I started pushing it toward the wall more. And then I heard a faint scraping sound. Afterward, the edge of a metallic object appeared hidden behind the desk. I reached out and pulled it out. It was a small box. A very old iron box, covered in a thick layer of dust. The strange thing is that no one in the family knew of its existence. And even stranger, its key was the same brass key I found last night. I opened the box. I found many notebooks inside. Notebooks, old school notebooks. And every notebook had the name of one of my grandfather's grandchildren written on it. There was a notebook with my name, one for Sharif, and one for my sister, and a notebook for almost every child in the family. The feeling I got then was hard to describe. I felt like I had opened something that shouldn't have been opened at all. Curiosity was stronger than any other feeling. I sat on the floor and opened the notebook with my name on it. The first page was normal. Photos of me as a child, drawings, events, dates. But after a few pages, the writing started to change. My grandfather started recording very strange things. He had written, for example, Yusuf sees the window. And on a later page, Yusuf remembered the way today. And on a later page, Yusuf entered the room for the first time. At that moment, I felt goosebumps all over my body. I had never entered a strange room, or at least that's what I thought. I continued reading, and found a sentence that made me close the notebook for a moment from sheer tension. The sentence was, "Yusuf saw the house as it was." When I opened the rest of the notebooks, I discovered that every child in the family had a similar one, but the notes were different. Sharif, for example, my grandfather wrote that he sees the hallway. And my Aunt Nadia, when she was young, he wrote that she sees the downstairs room. And Uncle Fatih, he wrote that he sees the roof. And suddenly the picture began to come together in a terrifying way. Everyone in the family remembered a different part of the house, not because they imagined it, no, but because my grandfather himself was taking them to see it. The only question that kept hanging in my mind at that moment, where would he see it? All these places don't exist, or at least they don't exist now. At that exact moment, I heard my grandmother's voice behind me. She was standing at the door looking at me with a strange calmness, and said only one sentence. A sentence that let true terror sink into me. "You have arrived at the wrong place." She fell silent. I looked at her in confusion and raised my eyebrows. So she continued her speech. And said that, but the problem is that this wrong place did exist. After my grandmother said that sentence, I stood in my place looking at her, feeling that all the questions that had been spinning inside my head since I returned home were finally starting to get an answer. But at the same time, I felt the answer itself might be far worse than the mystery. As long as the truth is hidden from a person, they hold hope that it will turn out simple, logical, or even understandable. But when the story keeps growing in front of you day after day and you find all the evidence saying that something is truly wrong, that's when you start fearing the truth itself before you even know it. My grandmother sat on the wooden chair next to my grandfather's room door. And it was the first time since the story began that I felt she was truly tired. Not just physical exhaustion, no, but the exhaustion of long years of keeping a secret no one knew but her. She remained silent for a long time while looking at the notebooks open before us before she started speaking in a low voice as if she were talking to herself more than to me. The house back then was not as you see it now. Every generation would add a room, remove a room, close a door, or open a door. The house continued to grow and change for over 70 continuous years to the point that its shape changed dozens of times, but the problem isn't here. Any old house naturally changes. The real problem is that your grandfather had a strange obsession with this house. He was convinced that the house was being lost with every change. Every change that happened to it, bend that happened to it. And that every wall demolished or door closed took with it a part of the lives of the people who lived in it. As I sat listening to her, I began to remember very small situations I had completely forgotten. Situations that were normal back then, but now have become terrifying. I remembered that my grandfather did indeed take each grandchild aside at a certain age, and they would sit with him for hours away from everyone else. And when we would return, we would talk about different places inside the house. And each one of us had seen something different from the other. But our families used to consider this childish play, and they would forget it with time. Here I asked her the question that had been eating at my mind since the first day. "So, these rooms really did exist, Grandma?" She looked at me for a very long time, and then she said, "Yes, my dear, they did exist. But not all at the same time." That sentence was the real key to the whole story. Suddenly, I understood that the problem was never that someone was lying or that someone's memory was failing. The problem was that each one of us remembered a different version of the house from a different time. Uncle Fatih remembered the attic room that was removed years before I was even born. And my aunt remembered the room downstairs that was filled in before she even grew up. And Sharif remembered the corridor that was closed off and a wall was built in its place. And each one of us was convinced that they actually lived in that place because they really saw it. But how did they see it? In here, my grandmother opened the last door in the story. Your grandfather's whole life used to collect old photos of the house and drawings, maps, and everything related to it. And he was convinced that places do not disappear when they're demolished, and that memories room inside the place, even if the shape has changed. And over time, he started doing strange things. He would take the small children to the places that had changed and tell them about it in detail and show them the old pictures and sit for hours describing their shape until the child would start to imagine them as if they were really in front of him. But this had a goal in his mind. Your grandfather, a few months before he died, was convinced that the house itself had started to disappear from his memory because his memory had started to fade. And he was drawing his memory from the kids as they told him about the things he had told them long ago. And he was terrified of the day the last person who remembered would die. The shape of the old house. Because then all the people who lived in it would disappear for a second time. At that moment, I understood why he made these notebooks, and why he was recording everything, and why he was taking us one by one. He wasn't trying to scare us. He was trying to remember the shape of the house and save its memory, because he was in love with this house. He built the house with his sweat and toil, and got married in it, and built his whole family. It was very hard for him to change anything in the house, to tear down a wall or build another one, to install a door or remove it. Any change in the house meant a change in his memories, and this affected him. Days later, we finished the sale procedures. The house was sold, and the workers began to enter and empty the old rooms, moving the furniture. I was convinced that this story had finally ended, and that the horror I lived the past few days was because we faced the past all at once after years of running from it. But on the last day before I left, one thing happened. But it was something that made me unable to forget the house, that for the rest of my life. I was walking through the old corridor for the last time. The whole house was almost empty. And when I passed by the wall behind the sitting room, I noticed a very small part of the bricks had fallen because of the workers' work, and a narrow cavity was visible behind it. My curiosity made him cold, and I reached my hands inside the opening, and I found something small. A photo. A very old photo. Folded in the middle. When I unfolded it, I felt that I was standing there myself. The photo was taken inside the house, and it had my grandfather in it, and it had me in it. The problem is that this photo was taken in the year 1970. Years before I was born. I kept looking at this photo for a very long time, while trying to convince myself that I am either delusional, or this person resembles me, or the date is wrong, or there is another logical explanation. But the more I looked at the face, I knew it was my own face. And until today, after long years have passed since the house was sold, completely demolished, and a building was built in its place, I still keep this photo inside my desk drawer. And every so often I take it out and look at it, trying to discover something new. But the strange thing is that every time I open it, I feel like the background has changed slightly from the last time I saw it. Maybe this is just an illusion, or my mind playing tricks. And maybe memories truly move with time. But the only thing I am sure of is that the old house was sold and disappeared from the face of the earth. But a part of it remained alive inside all of us. And another part remained with me personally, which is the old photo, the photo where I exist 17 years before I was even born. And with that, today's episode comes to an end, along with today's story and experience. You have the right, my friend, to believe or disbelieve, all or part of the episode. But these are the listeners' experiences, your own stories. I thank the writer Ezeldin Abdel Fattah for writing the episode in the radio style you heard just now. I also thank the writer Lisa Zegel for preparing all the episodes of the General Horror program. Finally, I thank Mustafa El Masri for the sound effects and music. I thank you all for listening. If you are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and join the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you receive everything new. As for those who like to support me, please don't forget to like, comment, and share. Thank you very much. You were with Muhammad Gawili in the General of Horror program. Peace.